Do you ever read accident reports? Try to glean from them what happened to somebody and think about how you might handle that emergency if you were in that situation? Well, stick with us on FlyWire. We're going to do hopefully do just that. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire we're going to do something that I used to do when I was a newbie. Magazines back in those days would actually publish accident reports, just the bare bones about what happened and how the pilot reacted and what the result was. With the whole idea is that we can learn from their mistakes, you know, what happened to them, and think about what they did and how it went wrong, horribly wrong, and we might use that as a learning lesson for the future. I don't see that much these days anymore. So I decided that I was going to do that. I was going to look at a recap of the 2019 accidents for Bonanzas all across the Bonanza fleet, and just kind of see what happened and see if there's any trends or anything like that jump out at me. So that's what I did, and of course that's preliminary data. There wasn't a final report in the bunch for 2019. I wouldn't expect that for another year or two. NTSB gets a little bit behind. They have so many accidents to deal with, and they really don't go investigate all of them. Some of them they use what other people have done. So I went on the accident list, and for all the Bonanzas, the 36s and the 33s and the 35s, to me they're all Bonanzas. They're just slight variations of it. There's 44 accidents on the, these are my notes, 44 accidents on the FAA and TSP database. And some of those are in registered airplanes that crashed in foreign countries, and we don't have those reports. Not sure when or if those will ever show up. And unfortunately, there were 21 fatalities noted in those accidents. These are just Bonanzas, that's all I'm talking about. The A36, by the way, like behind me, was overrepresented in the number of crashes. There's quite a few A36s, oh well. As of a couple of weeks ago, there were 9,891 Bonanzas on the FAA registry. And here's a morbid statistic for you. Given that crash rate of 44 airplanes a year, it's going to take 224 years before we can crash them all. And I say that because I'm actually not trying to be funny. And what I'm saying is that I'm actually trying to stand on my soapbox, because I think we can, and we must learn from others' mistakes instead of learning from our own, because there aren't enough airplanes or lives really to learn all that, to learn what we need to know from making our own mistakes. It's better to learn from our mistakes and others and to get better all the time, and think about it. So let's look at some of the trend items before going over a few of the accident reports. One thing I wanted to say about this is the trend items is it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like, okay, there's this many and that many. Some of them fill both columns or many columns. So this is just a snapshot of the situation. Engine failures, there were 16 engine failures. That seems like a lot to me. 4 of them were on takeoff, 3 of them were on landing. Fuel was an issue in some of those. 9 were at cruise. Forced landings off airport. There were gear up, 2, no fatalities, no real idea of the extent of damage, but no fatalities, no injuries, so I would expect minimal damage. There were 6 geared down forced landings off airport. All the aircraft were destroyed, and in 50% of those there were fatalities. It makes you wonder about geared down landings off airport. I've talked about that in previous videos. Maybe we need to have another video that focuses on it in particularly. And one of the accident reports I'm going to go over is one of those, and we'll talk about it, and we'll review why I think it's a bad idea. On airport, there were 2 forced landings, by the way. They didn't end up really pretty either, but there were. Takeoff, there were 13 takeoff incidents The trend item, big trend item for me is takeoff into low clouds. 2 of them were loss of control on IFR departures at 500, 800 feet overcast. One of them was a loss of control VFR, and I think they intended to stay VFR, but they didn't, they couldn't, because it was 800 foot overcast, and did not turn out well. There were engine issues, 4 of them on takeoff, and the rest of them were distraction, incorrect technique, things, misset trim, pulling the airplane off too early, CFIT, that's control flight into terrain, unexplained, for unexplained reasons. One of them was right after takeoff. He got up to 100 feet and then it just descended into the terrain. And it's just a distraction? I don't know. I mean, we can't figure that one out. Landing, there were 12 landing incidents. Gear up, 4 of them. 3 of them basically forgot to put the gear down. One of them was drunk, and one of them was partially deployed. But it was unknown if it was partial before or after the touchdown. There were 2 improper go-arounds, 7 loss of control, anything from locking the brakes, runway departures to the drift, high speed, crosswind, control flight into terrain, CFIT, and stalls. Just kind of across the board there. So engine failures, takeoff, and landing, those are all bad. Miscellaneous things, there was 1 control flight in terrain on a dark VMC night. The airplane impacted the ground, the desert, 32 miles from the airport, and he was diverting from an airport with bad weather into this airport. Didn't make it, so you could think that he had helmet fire going on, and he just lost situational awareness about where he was and what altitude he was at, and it did not end well. There were 2 ditchings. One of them seemed to be attributed to fuel contamination, but the ditching occurred under unusual circumstances. There's a YouTube video on that and everything, and I'm not going to get into it. One of them occurred into Lake Michigan, and water temps were above 40 degrees, about 40 degrees, and that's cold. I'm here to tell you. And in both of these cases, both of these ditching cases, hypothermia was an issue, as well as the lack of crew or passenger flotation devices. I guess you got to ask yourself when you fly over water, how far you fly over water is just how long can you tread water, or how far can you swim when it's really cold. You know that at temperatures of about 40 degrees, maybe even just in that range, your hands, you lose control of your fingers, and they become just clubs, pretty much within 5 to 10 minutes. Not very long. I can't remember exactly. We used to teach that in the Air Force, but I don't remember that now. All I remember is you don't got much time in cold water like that. So got to be careful about that. Mechanical, there's one man, it sure sounds like flutter to me. It had a loud bang and vibration. They landed and the fuselage was really bent and wrinkled, so it sounds like flutter to me. Fortunately, no one was killed. The airplane didn't crash. Low-level maneuvering, oh my gosh, there was one of those. 3 people died. They struck a power line at 50 feet. And I could, why? I just don't understand. I don't understand that at all. There are fuel issues. There were at least 5. One I mentioned is a possible contamination. All the others occurred with fuel on board, someplace. The investigators looked into how much fuel was in each tank in only one case, and the others are murky. But my nickel on the grass is that fuel unporting was likely an issue in the other 4 cases. And I don't know if you remember or not, but the POH recommends against landing with less than 13 gallons in a tank, because it turns into that tank, say you're on the left tank and you make a left turn, well, the fuel's going to flow away from the fuel intake. So unporting is a very real situation, and it might result in power loss. And when you roll out, it doesn't mean you're going to get continuous fuel flow back into that intake. It might take a while. It might take you to turn on the pump, and a lot of times that didn't happen. And in particular, the one case we're going to talk about. With all of that in mind, I'd like to cover a few accident reports in detail. I'm not going to mention names or particular aircraft. That stuff isn't important to me. What is important is that these accidents occurred to both high and low time pilots, and I think for every one of them, there are things we can learn from them and go forward with. Here's one. It was a 35, substantially damaged during runway excursion after landing. Nice day, light winds. According to the pilot, after landing on the runway, it was 8,000 feet long. Halfway through the rollout at a speed of 40 to 50 knots, the airplane suddenly veered to the right. The pilot attempted to correct the turn with left pedal and brake, but was unsuccessful. The pilot confirmed the power was at idle, and then the airplane departed the runway into the grass, struck a berm, flipped over, and came to rest inverted. The pilot further stated that they had not applied the brakes or retracted the flaps from their 10-degree position before the airplane veered to the right. 2 minor injuries in this case. Witnesses observed white smoke coming from the main tires immediately before the airplane began to veer. Black skid marks were found on the runway leading off the right edge into the grass. Both wheel brakes, both rotavators, the nose wheel, steering all functioned normally when pressing the rudder pedals. The airplane did not have the optional co-pilot side brake pedals installed. The parking brake was disengaged. Visual and mechanical inspection of the brake components revealed that there were no problems. Everything operated normally, no hydraulic leaks, and both main landing gear wheels rolled normally. They did note that the right main landing gear had a flat spot worn through the reinforcement cords in the tread section of the tire. So how do you solve this one? You know, you're rolling out, you're about 50 knots, and the airplane veers to the right. Well, one thing I think we can tell is, you know, it destroyed the airplane when it went off the runway. Hit a berm, flipped over, it was a total mess. Fortunately, the people weren't really hurt. But I think that shows you that it's better to stay on the runway than off. So directional control and staying on the runway would seem to be the number one objective here. So what do? Well, I guess you lock up both tires. Do what you have to do. Blow the tires, stay on the runway, do whatever you can do to stay on the runway. I'm going to save this one to the last. Let's do the forced landing. These really make me sad, the forced landings. I think maybe I need to do a video on this one because this particular one, it's an A36. The pilot did almost everything right and then died. The airplane was substantially damaged in a forced landing following in-flight loss of engine power. The pilot reported the loss of engine power during cruise flight about 3,000 mean sea level. What is that, 2,000 feet-ish above the ground. In that area there was attempts to restore the engine power were not successful. Executed a forced landing into a wheat field. Okay. The airplane came to rest upright on the southeast heading. Okay, he executed a forced landing in the wheat field. Okay, that's good stuff. I didn't have much choice, but he did that. And here's the thing I want you to think about. The impact debris path was approximately 75 feet long. Ground depressions consistent with impact from the main landing gear wheels were located about 50 feet from the airplane. The fuselage nose structure was partially separated forward of the firewall. The engine remained attached to the nose structure and the propeller remained attached to the engine. It goes on to other damage, and they had a small fire as well. So I did the math on this one, and I think that more than likely he was doing around 100 to 110 knots, and the deceleration force for this particular accident, when you dissipate that kind of speed in 75 feet, that's not much distance. That's not much, that is a lot of G, and it worked out when I did the math to about 22 G. That's a lot of G. And the human body cannot survive a abrupt decel of 26 G. It starts to rip apart your aorta and dislocate your various organs that you have in your body. And that's a lot of energy to dissipate in 75 feet. So I want you to think about that as the gear up would have spread the deceleration over 200 feet or more, quite a bit more. My nickel on the grass is that would have been a whole lot better to slow that deceleration down so our little bodies don't get ripped apart. And unfortunately, there was one fatal, one serious, and one minor injury in this accident, and it didn't have to be that way. I feel terrible about that. Here's one, and I've got a picture I'll show you on this one. This is another forced landing. V-35, one serious and one minor injury. Again, experienced a total loss of engine power and cruise flight. Made a forced landing into a field. Airplane sustained substantial damage. As you can see from the picture here, this engine actually blew a hole in the side of the crankcase, so he didn't have much choice. He landed in a wheat field. It was great. There was a lot, or cornfield. There was a lot of tall corn, and frankly, the corn crop is probably pretty cheap compared to what happened to the airplane. And he put his gear down. He put his gear down and ripped the nose off, and substantial. I mean, the airplane's trashed. And I think landing in that cornfield with no gear, he probably would have been a fairly short, but the deceleration would be those corn stalks doing most of it, and the airplane probably wouldn't be hurt, and the people definitely wouldn't be hurt at all. So I want you to think, I would like you to think, here's that nickel on the grass, is if you're landing off airport, you know you're not going to be on a hard surface, leave the gear up. Dissipate that energy over a longer distance, and the airplane's job is to protect you. And why put the gear down? I just don't. I don't get it. We're gonna have to look at that a little bit more depth. Okay, so yeah, here I want to talk about unporting. This is fuel starvation and unporting. Again, this is an A-36, resulted in one serious, one minor injury. This A-36 lost engine power during a practice instrument approach, and I don't believe that at all. He impacted the ground 5 miles away from the runway, southeast of the runway. So anyway, he did do a practice instrument approach and broke it off early. He originated from an airport 464 miles away from his destination airport, and then he did this practice approach about 20 miles, maybe a little less from his destination. So when he departed, he told the inspector, the FAA inspector, that before departing that both tanks were 3/4 full. And he maintained his fuel balance by switching the left and right tanks several times during the flight. And he requested and received vectors for a practice ILS. And then following slower traffic, he got tired of that and said he wanted to terminate that and continue on to his destination. And shortly after climbing to 1,500 feet, the engine lost power, and the pilot switched the fuel selector to the other tank, and attempted to restart the engine to no avail. But he failed to turn on the electric boost pump, as required by the emergency checklist, because he was too low to the ground. He lowered the landing gear, but elected not to lower the flaps for landing. The airplane touched down on soft earth, and the nose gear collapsed. Too much energy, as I was saying before. So the FAA looked at this airplane in detail, and they said that the fuel gauges indicated slightly more than 1/4 full in the left tank, but the right tank was empty. Visual inspection of the tanks revealed a small unknown quantity of fuel in the left tank, and the right fuel tank was empty. A fuel selector was positioned on the left tank. So I worked on the math on this one too, and that works out to about 3 hours-ish of flight for an A-36. And Lena Peak, that would have been about 45 gallons, which means that if you're going to run right there in Nat's ass, it would have been 52 gallons required for VFR reserve. And your 3/4 of tanks nominally would give you 60 gallons, right? Well, Richard Peak, if you were flying Richard Peak, it would have given you required 51 gallons and just over 60 for a VFR reserve. But the trouble is that the fuel gauges in these airplanes, these factory fuel gauges, they're just not accurate. They're not even required to be accurate. They're required to be accurate when they're empty and when it's full. But in between, who knows? Unless you know that airplane really well and you've come to tell that, yeah, this means that by comparing how much fuel you put in that tank, when it's reading that, you might have an idea. But if you don't do that, and you don't have a fuel system that tells you what your burn rate is, then you just have no idea. And he didn't top the tanks off for a really long cross country. He had minimal options and minimal time available when he got to his destination. But the thing I want you to pick up from this too is that besides that's an aeronautical decision making and a risk that he took that I don't understand. I still have a tough time with, but he took it. But the investigators found that the fuel selector was on the left tank, and there was fuel in that tank, but it was definitely less than 10 gallons. The book, remember, we talked about it earlier, says if you maneuver with less than 13 gallons, basically you stand a chance of importing that tank. And if you do that, then you cannot get fuel to flow back through that line to the engine unless you turn on the Duke's pump. And he didn't do that in this case, so he never got the engine back. So that was definitely, in my opinion, fuel unporting and ended up in an accident. But management, maybe that's another video we need to talk about too, is how to manage your fuel in these airplanes. To me, that 13 gallons, that's not the minimum. For me, it's more like 15 to 18 gallons is what my minimum is for that. So if I keep that much for my fuel planning purposes. So if I have to go to that tank, I know I can land on it. I can maneuver on it, I can land on it, I'm not going to run out of gas. And I think that's more important than balance. I've flown the airplane with no fuel in one tank and fuel in the other tank, and it's really not that hard. I would rather have, I don't do that commonly, but I've done it before, and I just think it's more important to fly the airplane managing your fuel with those restrictions. At my home airport, right here where we are, several years ago, another Bonanza did exactly this, landing with less than a quarter of a tank of gas on his fuel gauge, and the turn to final, he imported the fuel and he landed in the field. And fortunately, he didn't damage the airplane. He did put the gear down, and fortunately, it was a great big field and it didn't hurt anything, and he was able to not flip over or anything, and they were able to get the airplane out again. So it was ended up being no harm kind of incident. His gear was already down, by the way, because he was in the final turn. But nevertheless, you got to know your systems. You just got to know your systems. All right, here's another trend item. I think it seems to me that's to me it's a bit of a pet peeve situation, and this is takeoff into IMC. Okay, this one is let's go over this one, and none of the takeoffs into low clouds and loss of control ended well. None of them. And this one here breaks my heart. It's an A-36 destroyed during collision with terrain. Day instrument meteorological conditions prevailed in the vicinity of the accident flight, and the flight was not operated on a flight plan. He was VFR, and his passenger were VFR. The whole flight lasted 17 minutes. He had ADS-B on board, so they were able to reconstruct the flight path, and he took off, and they didn't mention about how high he'd gotten, but I'm sure he was much higher than 800 feet, and he did several turns and multiple course changes and backtracking, including 360-degree turns. So it sounds to me like he took off into the low clouds and he was hunting for a way through, and it didn't work out. The accident site was located in an agricultural field bordered by trees on two sides. The airplane came to a rest upright about 250 feet from both tree lines on a northwesterly heading. No evidence of tree strikes was observed on the airplane. The fuselage, engine, and propeller were located in the accident site in position relative to the intact plane. They were partially buried in an impact crater immediately adjacent to the fuselage. So in other words, it impacted the terrain, the engine and prop were ripped off, and the airplane then did some gyrations and ended up. The forward fuselage was crushed and the cockpit area was compromised. We talked about G's before, but there's so many things here that say about VFR and IMC, but it all boils down to just don't do it. Why do it? Scud running, I mean, it's not even marginal VFR, 800 feet. You can stay in the pattern maybe at that altitude, but that's just terrible. The winds, by the way, were 250 at 18 gust 28, and it was 800 overcast. Something about 800 overcast. Here's another one. Takeoff into IMC, winds were calm, 800 overcast. The takeoff occurred right at sunrise. It was just that transition with heavy clouds, so it was still pretty dark and gray. F-33A destroyed when it impacted a residential area. IMC conditions prevailed and an IMC flight plan was filed. The pilot did multiple weather briefings, and he reported to the briefer that he planned to depart between 05 and 0600 due to forecasted thunderstorms that were expected later in the day. Don't know where he was going. Review of the preliminary ATC comm provided by the FAA said that he received his full route IFR clearance, acknowledged it correctly, and about 10 minutes later he was clear for takeoff. Shortly after takeoff, he was instructed to contact the departure. He subsequently radioed departure, but he was still transmitting on tower. Tower provided the new departure, the correct departure frequency. The pilot read that back, but there were no further transmissions from the pilot to the tower or to departure. So apparently he did not have his radio or that radio frequency selected, so it was an easy change. And perhaps he got head down or whatever trying to change that radio. But review of the preliminary radar track showed the airplane maintained runway heading for approximately 4 miles or 2.5 minutes, climbed to 1,000 feet, and at a ground speed of between 110 and 140 knots. And then at 6:14, so what does that work out to be, like 30 seconds later, the airplane entered a descent, the ground speed accelerated, and the airplane turned to about a 350 heading. Important thing to remember, 350 heading. The last recorded radar data was at 6:14 and 20 seconds, about 0.15 nautical miles from the initial impact point, and they recorded the airplane at 500 MSL, heading 349 degrees at 178 knots ground speed. So he had really picked up speed and descended about 500 feet, and he was still obviously in a descent. So witnesses described the airplane flying low, and it flew straight, not banking in either direction, and basically flew into the ground. And the initial impact point was in a residential backyard with the wreckage path oriented on a 350-degree heading. And debris were scattered about 330 feet from the initial impact to the main wreckage. This one, you know, to me, actually, here's the thing, is I find this kind of takeoff from totally VFR. I've been walking around on the ground. I'm not in the clouds. I'm not in the airplane. I used to looking at my instruments, and then jumping in the airplane and then flying into low clouds. I find that the scariest thing about IFR flying, frankly. Shooting an approach to MENS, you mean your heart rate may be up and it may be tense, but the outcome is determined by a clear decision matrix, okay? Follow the rules, and then you're going to be okay. You're either going to be in a position where you can land, or you're going to go around and go missed approach and shoot another one and go somewhere else, things like that, okay? And it's all just a flow of what you've been doing while you've been on the gauges. But this takeoff is a serious transition from basically VFR orientation. I've been here into, now my focus goes real narrow with all these different sensations that I have to tune out. Focus on the instruments, time turn, twist, throttle, torque, change my frequencies, all that kind of stuff, narrowing my focus and my cross-check. don't doubt it. That's a hard one to do. That is one of the most dangerous things, I think, is take off into low clouds. And this definitely needs to be another video. So those are some of the accident reports that I wanted to talk about, kind of some trend items that I see in accidents. And unfortunately, there's no new ways to crash a Bonanza in last year's data. There's some pretty sad ones. There's some things there that I think as pilots, if we spend a little bit more time thinking about the situations and maybe training for, doing a little bit more regular training, here's my pitch again for training, then we could avoid those bad situations. So I'm hoping next year maybe we'll look at these accidents again and look at the accidents for 2020, and hopefully they go down. At least we don't see any more of the IMC, takeoff into IMC, loss of control, or gear down, engine out landings, forced landings. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear what you have to say, any comments you have to make. That all adds to the conversation, and that's kind of what it's all about. So I appreciate you watching. And if you like the video, hit subscribe. It is going to be right down there. And hit the bell for notifications if you want to be notified the next time a video comes out. And I appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time on FlyWire.